high in the Appalachian ridges of Georgia, where dirt tracks vanish into shadow and cabins cling to silence, one clan of men lived apart from the world. They seemed invisible, just another group of mountain men surviving off hunting and scraps of farmland. But inside their wooden homestead, a darkness festered that few could ever imagine. In 1978, a 15-year-old boy collapsed during a rare trip into town. When rushed into a rural hospital, doctors believed they were treating simple exhaustion. Instead, they uncovered a secret so disturbing it would unravel decades of silence, expose a hidden dynasty of twisted lineage, and etch the name Willard Dawson into Georgia's darkest criminal record. His wasn't only one crime, it was a legacy. A generational system of control among men, twisting loyalty and bloodlines into something monstrous. And it all began to collapse because one boy carried a truth too heavy to hide. Before we descend into this grim chapter of history, take a moment to support the channel. If you believe hidden truths must be uncovered and remembered, hit like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps keep these difficult stories alive. The year was 1978, and the Appalachian foothills in northern Georgia remained a world apart. Dirt roads wound into the mountains where clans of men clung to tradition, their cabins weathered by isolation and time. One such cabin belonged to the Dawson men. Descendants of mountain settlers, they lived far from town, seldom speaking to outsiders. It was here that Willard Dawson ruled as father, patriarch, and unquestioned authority among his sons. Life for the Dawson men was harsh, shaped by hard labor, hunting, and secrecy. Outsiders rarely approached. Those who did sensed something unsettling, walls of silence thicker than the pine forests surrounding their homestead. Everything changed one autumn morning when Willard brought his 15-year-old son into town. The boy had been weak for weeks, pale and unsteady. In the middle of errands, his legs gave out, and he collapsed unconscious. Panic rippled briefly through Willard, though he concealed it quickly. He carried his son through the hospital doors, claiming the boy had fainted before. Doctors rushed forward, immediately sensing something deeper was wrong beneath the surface. Dr. Richard Thornton, a seasoned physician, was on duty. He noted how Willard refused eye contact, hovering close to his son, bristling whenever staff suggested thorough tests. Thornton's instincts told him this was no ordinary case. The boy's initial examinations revealed troubling conditions. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and anemic. Thornton pressed for further evaluation. Willard's resistance grew visible. His insistence on leaving immediately made alarms ring louder in every trained observer's mind. A crucial moment came when administrative forms required Willard's attention. For the first time, the boy was left alone with Dr. Thornton and another male attendant. In those few moments, the silence began to break. The boy's words, whispered and halting, stunned the doctor. He revealed truths no child should ever carry, describing acts commanded by his own father. It was enough to confirm Thornton's worst fears about the Dawson household. Thornton immediately contacted Sheriff David Miller. Within the hour, Miller arrived at the hospital, his presence filling the corridor with grim authority. He ordered Willard detained, while the boy remained under protective medical observation. Investigators secured a warrant for the Dawson property. When deputies entered the cabin, what they discovered chilled them. Bare rooms, rotting wood, scattered mattresses, and provisions barely enough to sustain the group of men. Yet the most disturbing discovery was hidden deeper. Behind a locked door, deputies found a small boy around 2 years old. Malnourished and frail, he bore physical signs suggesting generations of inbreeding within the Dawson line. Willard's authority had hidden this child from every official record. No birth certificate, no doctor's visit, no trace of existence. His mere survival spoke volumes about the secrecy and corruption that thrived in isolation. The investigation widened quickly. School records revealed Willard had pulled his sons out of education early, claiming he would handle their learning. In truth, The boys grew without instruction, trapped in a world crafted entirely by their father. Neighbors, though distant, admitted the Dawson men appeared in town rarely, perhaps a few times yearly. Willard often arrived with one or two sons, never the entire group, and conversations ended quickly under his cold, controlling glare. Deputies pieced together the survival of the Dawson clan. Hunting, trapping, and occasional sales of animal skins supplemented a meager inheritance Willard received years earlier. It explained their persistence, but not the deeper darkness uncovered. As word spread, the hospital became the focal point of a growing storm. Doctors, law enforcement, and officials realized the fainting of one boy had cracked open a generational secret rooted in silence and control. By day's end, Willard sat in custody, his jaw set, his eyes betraying no remorse. His authority had ruled the mountain cabin for decades, but within hours it had begun to crumble forever. The Dawson homestead sat at the end of a dirt track, a place where isolation clung heavier than the mountain fog. Generations of Dawson men had lived there, their bloodline twisting deeper with every passing decade. The main structure was a two-story wooden cabin built long ago by Willard's grandfather. Time had rotted its beams, and sections of the roof sagged dangerously. Broken shutters rattled in the wind, whispering secrets of neglect. Around the cabin stood remnants of survival, an abandoned barn, a shallow well, and patches of weak soil where the Dawson men tried to coax crops. Yet survival was secondary. Secrecy had always been their highest priority. Inside, deputies found rooms stripped of comfort. Mattresses without sheets lay scattered across the floorboards. The air reeked of damp wood, unwashed clothing, and smoke from a failing stove. It was a house built for containment, not warmth. Electricity sputtered from a failing diesel generator, while water came from buckets drawn from the old well. Hygiene was absent. For the Dawson men, deprivation was normal, as if hardship itself were a tradition passed down. The boys appeared withdrawn, avoiding direct eye contact with deputies. Their posture spoke of obedience beaten into them. Each gesture seemed calculated, as though they feared even breathing too loudly in their father's absence. Among them, Jacob and Thomas, two of the older sons, stood taller but carried vacant expressions. Their erratic behavior flickered between silent apathy and bursts of aggression, signs of psychological fractures born from long-term isolation and genetic decline. Samuel, only 10, sat quietly in a corner, rocking slowly. His eyes darted nervously at every sound. Next to him, the youngest, barely 8, clung to silence as though words were forbidden currency. The small, hidden boy discovered earlier remained under medical supervision elsewhere. His presence haunted investigators, evidence that secrecy had crossed from father to sons, binding them to a cycle none had escaped. Willard's shadow lingered in every corner. Old hunting rifles leaned against the walls, reminders of his authority. The sons obeyed rules even in his absence, moving with mechanical caution as if he still watched. Deputies cataloged meager supplies, canned goods, animal hides, and jars of dried meat. No books, no records, nothing suggesting education. This was not a home for growth, but a fortress meant to seal boys from the outside. Tracing records back generations, investigators learned that Willard's father and grandfather also raised sons in this cabin. Each generation had lived and died in the same house, repeating cycles of control and corrupted tradition. Neighbors interviewed later recalled that whenever Willard brought sons into town, conversations ended quickly. Any attempt to ask about other boys was cut short. Suspicion existed, but no one dared to confront him directly. One merchant admitted Willard purchased large amounts of supplies at once, then vanished into the mountains for months. He often appeared stern, his tone sharp, discouraging even the boldest men from prying into his affairs. It became clear that the Dawson homestead was more than a house. It was a prison built from wood and fear. Every plank, Every locked door, every silence reinforced Willard's reign as unchallenged patriarch. The land itself reflected the decay of its inhabitants. The barns sagged, tools rusted, fences fell. Yet the men never repaired them fully. Their labor was spent maintaining survival, not progress, reinforcing the cycle of stagnation. For investigators, the mountain house explained much: the malnourishment, the silence, the secrecy. But it also raised darker questions. How deep did Willard's control go? And how many generations had suffered within those walls? As deputies sealed off the property, word spread quietly through the county. What had long been rumored about the Dawsons was no longer speculation. The mountain house had finally surrendered its secrets, brick by rotting brick. Behind the cabin's weathered boards, deputies discovered a locked room at the far end of the hall. The door creaked open to reveal a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Inside, crouched in the shadows, was a small boy barely 2 years old. His body was frail, his limbs thin, his skull oddly shaped. He had never been outside the cabin walls. The boy's condition told a silent story. Malnutrition was clear in his shallow chest and weak muscles. More disturbing were genetic abnormalities. Signs of inbreeding passed through generations of Dawson men without interruption. Deputies carried the boy into daylight for the first time. He squinted against the brightness, covering his face as though sunlight itself was a foreign intruder. His cries were faint, his voice underdeveloped. No medical record existed for him. No birth certificate, no vaccinations, nothing that tied him to the world beyond Willard's control. It was as though the boy had been erased before he began. Doctors at the hospital confirmed the worst. The child had congenital issues, misaligned features, developmental delays, and a weak heart. Each symptom bore the weight of decisions made long before his short life began. Willard offered no explanation. When questioned, his eyes remained cold, his answers deflecting. To him, the hidden boy was not abnormal. He was simply another product of a system Willard considered unbroken tradition. Investigators realized the discovery meant far more than one neglected child. It confirmed that secrecy in the Dawson homestead was deeper than anyone imagined. Silence was not only a rule, it was survival. The older sons admitted little. Some glanced toward the floor when asked about their youngest brother, suggesting they knew but had been forbidden to acknowledge his existence. Fear had bound their tongues tighter than any chain. The hidden boy's arrival in town shook even hardened officials. Men who had seen violent crimes stood speechless at the sight of a toddler robbed of care, trapped in an existence designed only by his father. Hospital staff worked tirelessly to stabilize him. Intravenous fluids dripped, machines measured heartbeats, and specialists cataloged every abnormality. Yet beneath the science, each man present understood this was the human cost of isolation. Prosecutors began compiling evidence. The hidden son became the centerpiece of their case, a living symbol of the dangers bred in secrecy. He was undeniable proof that Willard's reign had destroyed innocence from its roots. The boy's image circulated among state officials. His thin arms and vacant stare carried a message stronger than any testimony. Lawmen knew jurors would not forget the sight when trial eventually came. Neighbors who had long suspected oddities were now horrified. The idea that a boy had lived unseen, hidden from sunlight and education, made them question how much silence their community had tolerated. Sheriff Miller himself confessed privately that he felt haunted. Each night after visiting the hospital, he replayed the boy's blank stare. It was, he admitted, a reminder of collective failure. The hidden son did not speak much. Doctors noted his limited vocabulary and delayed responses. Yet even in silence, he told a louder truth. What happens when generations of men seal themselves from accountability? For investigators, this discovery cemented their determination. The case was no longer about one fainting spell in town. It had become a crusade to dismantle the Dawson dynasty of control, secrecy, and corruption. By winter's end, the hidden boy had become both victim and symbol. His presence ensured Willard's mountain empire could never be defended as ignorance or culture. It was now exposed as cruelty written across generations of sons. The Dawson bloodline stretched deep into the Appalachian Mountains, a chain of fathers and sons repeating the same rituals. Each generation withdrew further from society, convinced that isolation preserved strength, tradition, and loyalty. Records uncovered by investigators revealed disturbing continuity. Willard's grandfather, Edwin Dawson, wrote diaries describing his beliefs in keeping bloodlines unbroken among men. These writings became twisted scripture, guiding sons into cycles of silence and obedience. Edwin's son, Willard's father, continued the tradition. He raised his boys with stern discipline, forbidding contact with outsiders. Stories spread among neighbors of strange behaviors, yet none pressed further. Fear of confrontation outweighed suspicion. For decades, the Dawsons existed on the margins, venturing into town only when necessary. Each appearance carried an air of cold distance. Sons followed their father's lead, speaking little, eyes cast downward, voices trained into silence. Sheriff Miller traced property deeds back nearly a century. Each transfer of land passed strictly from father to son, never leaving Dawson hands. The mountain cabin became less a home and more a monument to control. Men in town recalled tales of Dawson brothers rarely mixing with outsiders. Rumors suggested strict codes enforced by their patriarchs, discouraging interaction. Such isolation produced a cycle where distorted practices thrived unchecked, cloaked in tradition. The hidden diaries provided more damning details. Edwin cataloged the traits of each son, noting which ones were strong or flawed. His obsession with preserving bloodline purity transformed fatherhood into something closer to livestock breeding. When Willard inherited authority, he accepted these writings as law. He treated them not as relics but as instructions. His sons became instruments of continuity, molded under rules designed by fathers long buried. Psychologists later testified that such generational conditioning created a closed system. Sons raised without outside influence viewed their father's word as unquestionable truth. Without comparison, they lacked tools to recognize abuse as abnormal. Isolation reinforced silence. The mountain terrain itself discouraged intrusion. Steep ridges, rough trails, and unpredictable weather made access difficult. Within this barrier, Dawson fathers shaped worlds where sons knew no authority but their patriarch. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of boys working the land. Their frail builds, odd mannerisms, and lack of schooling raised eyebrows. Yet in rural Georgia, suspicion rarely overcame respect for private property and self-reliance. When investigators confronted surviving Dawson men, patterns emerged. Each repeated the same phrases taught by Willard. Outsiders were dangerous, loyalty meant survival, silence protected the bloodline. These were not just words. They were indoctrination. Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist, later explained that each generation of Dawson's sons carried heavier burdens. Recessive traits compounded. Health problems, cognitive delays, and deformities multiplied. Silence not only hid abuse, it magnified suffering across decades. Court documents revealed how deeply this cycle reached. Even the youngest boys repeated their father's teachings with conviction. They believed the outside world would destroy them, never realizing they were already imprisoned by tradition. Sheriff Miller admitted that confronting this legacy felt like confronting a fortress. The Dawson men were not simply victims of one man's cruelty, but prisoners of an inherited system, enforced by fathers stretching back generations. Journalists covering the case described it as a dynasty of silence. Each generation raised sons to obey, ensuring no voice could challenge the structure. By 1978, that dynasty had finally cracked open. The discovery of the hidden boy marked the collapse of secrecy. But the investigation into generations of Dawsons revealed something far larger, a warning of what happens when isolation and silence harden into unquestioned law. As the state prepared for trial, the story of the Dawson line became more than one man's crime. It became a case study in generational control, proof that silence, when passed from father to son, becomes destructive legacy. At Clayton Hospital, the 15-year-old boy lay weak, his pale face staring at the ceiling. Doctors worked quietly, knowing his father's influence loomed heavy, even while Willard sat in custody under armed guard. Dr. Richard Thornton remained by the boy's side. Years of practice had taught him to recognize trauma beyond medicine. He sensed every word would require patience, trust, and the careful dismantling of fear. The boy spoke little at first. His responses were slow, fragmented, yet the smallest details carried weight: moments of pain, warnings whispered by brothers, orders barked by a father determined to enforce silence. Thornton enlisted a male counselor, Alan Winters, skilled in handling cases of abuse. Winters sat beside the boy daily, speaking gently, reminding him that no punishment could reach him here. At first, the boy repeated phrases drilled into him. Outsiders were dangerous. Silence meant safety. Loyalty defined manhood. Each sentence echoed the indoctrination passed from Willard and generations before him. Gradually, Winters gained his trust. He shared simple stories of life outside the mountains, sports teams, friendships, even basic schooling. To the boy, these concepts seemed alien, but they cracked small holes in his worldview. One afternoon, the boy finally described his reality. His words were halting, his eyes blank, but his meaning clear. His father demanded absolute control, and obedience required unspeakable submission from sons too young to resist. Thornton documented each confession carefully. He knew the weight these words carried, not only in medical reports, but in the courtroom that would soon hear them. The boy's voice was becoming the state's strongest weapon. The counselor noticed how the boy showed no understanding of wrong or right. To him, every command had been duty. His innocence had been reshaped into obedience, leaving him unable to see betrayal. Other Dawson sons were questioned separately. Jacob and Thomas, older but impaired, mumbled fragments of agreement. Their speech betrayed confusion, yet their eyes carried the same shadow: fear of betraying their father's commands. Samuel and the youngest boy remained silent, retreating into themselves. Investigators noted that their responses were robotic, as though rehearsed. The indoctrination was clear. Obedience to Willard outweighed even survival. For prosecutors, the challenge lay not only in proving abuse, but in explaining its mechanics. Generational silence had molded these boys, erasing their ability to judge. Their words reflected programming, not natural understanding. Thornton testified later that the boy's statements revealed deep cognitive delays. At 15, he reasoned like a child half his age. Years without education or outside contact had stunted his development beyond repair. Winters pressed gently, asking about the youngest hidden son. The 15-year-old hesitated before admitting what others feared. The boy was born under secrecy, fathered through corruption. His existence was proof of generations collapsing inward. This admission sealed the case. Prosecutors understood the boy's words could not be dismissed. His testimony would frame Willard not as ignorant, but as deliberate, perpetuating cycles that damaged every Dawson son under his command. Slowly, the boy began to accept that his suffering was not normal. Counselors explained that obedience did not mean abuse. For the first time, he realized his father's rules were neither sacred nor just. Breaking silence became liberation. Each sentence spoken aloud weakened Willard's invisible grip. Though frail, the boy's testimony would soon echo in court, carrying the weight of an entire line of sons raised under corruption. By the time hearings began, silence was no longer unbreakable. The boy had spoken, and with him spoke generations of Dawson's sons whose lives had been trapped in the shadow of a single patriarch. In March 1979, the trial of Willard Dawson began inside Rabun County's Red Brick Courthouse. Word had spread fast, and crowds of men gathered, eager to witness justice unfold against the notorious mountain patriarch. Reporters filled benches, their notebooks ready. For years, rumors of the Dawson men had lingered like smoke. Now, every eye focused on the man accused of corrupting generations of his own sons. Willard entered the courtroom shackled, his expression unreadable. He showed no emotion, no regret, no sign of fear. He stared straight ahead, as though the proceedings were beneath his consideration entirely. The prosecution, led by Howard Reeves, outlined the case with precision. He detailed the fainting boy's hospital collapse, the discovery of the hidden son, and the medical evidence linking generations of corruption to Willard's rule. Reeves presented doctors, counselors, and deputies. Each described what they witnessed: malnourished sons, genetic disorders, hidden children, and confessions whispered under protection. Together, these testimonies painted a picture darker than even rumors had suggested. Defense attorneys struggled. Their argument hinged on cultural isolation, that Willard had been raised without exposure to modern laws. Yet prosecutors countered with proof of his visits to town and his employment at a sawmill. Jurors listened intently. They saw through excuses. Willard was no ignorant hermit. He knew the outside world. He chose secrecy, chose corruption, and forced his sons into obedience under threat of punishment. The most powerful testimony came from the 15-year-old boy. He stood trembling, but his words carried undeniable weight. He described commands, punishments, and silence. Each sentence struck the courtroom like a hammer. Reporters scribbled furiously, documenting every phrase. Some men in the audience lowered their heads, unable to look at the boy as he recounted a world where obedience meant submission to his father's authority. Next came testimony about the hidden toddler. Doctors described congenital heart problems, neurological delays, and features caused by compounded inbreeding. This boy, they argued, represented the collapse of a bloodline twisted by secrecy. Geneticist Dr. Lawrence Freeman provided expert analysis. Charts displayed recessive traits compounded through generations. His words were clinical, but his message simple. The Dawson sons were victims of calculated choices, not unfortunate accidents. Sheriff Miller also testified, describing the moment he entered the Dawson cabin. His voice shook as he recalled the frail toddler hiding in shadows, a sight he admitted would remain with him forever. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier with each day. Journalists noted that silence often hung longer than words. Men shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had lived near a dynasty of abuse without stepping forward. Reeves closed with force. "This is not tradition. This is tyranny. This is a father enslaving his sons under false loyalty, using silence as his weapon." His words echoed, leaving jurors visibly shaken. The jury deliberated only 4 hours. Their verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. The weight of generations now rested squarely on Willard's shoulders, stripping him of the power he once wielded unchecked. Judge William Hartford delivered sentencing with a trembling voice. He imposed 3 consecutive 25-year terms, ensuring Willard would die behind bars. His gavel struck like thunder, sealing the patriarch's fate forever. Outside the courthouse, men gathered silently. Some expressed anger, others relief. Many admitted shame that such corruption had thrived in their mountains, hidden behind a facade of tradition, protected by fear of confrontation. Willard was led away in chains, his expression unchanged. But his dynasty of silence had been shattered. For the first time, the Dawson sons stood apart from their father's control, free to be heard. After the trial, the Dawson sons faced uncertain futures. Each carried scars, both physical and mental, shaped by years under their father's control. Freedom from Willard was only the beginning of their struggles. Jacob, the eldest, remained in state care. At 19, his development mirrored that of a boy half his age. He lacked independence, requiring constant supervision, unable to manage work or relationships beyond assisted routines. Thomas, 17 at the time, fared little better. Evaluations revealed cognitive delays, violent outbursts, and chronic kidney issues. By adulthood, he remained institutionalized, his health fragile until his eventual death years later from renal failure. Samuel, only 10 when rescued, showed potential for progress. Specialists provided tailored education and therapy. Though limited in comprehension, he eventually developed carpentry skills and now works within an assisted program for disabled men. The youngest son, rescued at 8, responded strongly to structured schooling. Though burdened by genetic disadvantages, he advanced further than his older brothers, learning to read, write, and manage daily life with greater independence. The hidden toddler, frail and weak, became a focus of medical intervention. Despite extensive care, his congenital heart issues persisted. He grew slowly, mentally delayed, yet defied expectations by surviving longer than doctors predicted. By adulthood, his mental capacity remained childlike. Yet within supportive housing, he found stability, learning basic routines. His existence remained a reminder of the collapse caused by generations of isolation and corruption. The 15-year-old boy who had fainted became both symbol and survivor. His testimony exposed Willard, but the cost was heavy. Years of therapy were required before he could understand the depth of betrayal. At 19, he spoke publicly for the first time. He told interviewers he wanted others to learn from his suffering, declaring that silence was not loyalty and isolation was not safety. His words inspired programs aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Counselors and educators used his story to identify warning signs among boys trapped in secrecy, ensuring future sons would not endure what he survived. Over time, some Dawson sons found modest independence. Assisted housing provided stability, therapy built trust, and work programs instilled purpose. Their lives were not free from hardship, but progress replaced despair. Reporters followed their journeys. Articles chronicled setbacks and victories, always reminding readers that the Dawson case was more than a trial. It was a lifelong consequence borne by sons struggling to reclaim humanity. Officials admitted systemic failure. Schools had ignored absences, neighbors had avoided confrontation, and agencies had failed to intervene. The Dawson sons became living evidence of how negligence enables abuse to flourish unchecked. For Jacob and Thomas, institutional life became permanent. Both remained dependent on caregivers. Their legacy reflected the genetic and psychological toll of choices made by fathers, choices reinforced for generations without interruption. For Samuel and the youngest, progress was possible. They developed skills, gained some independence, and formed modest social connections. Though never free of trauma, they showed resilience born of intervention and opportunity. The hidden toddler passed away in adulthood from congenital heart complications. His short life remained documented in medical journals as a grim case study of genetic decline through repeated inbreeding. The 15-year-old survivor lived into middle age, dedicating himself to outreach. He never fathered sons of his own, choosing instead to mentor others, determined to ensure cycles of silence would never repeat. The fate of the Dawson sons revealed more than suffering. It demonstrated endurance. Though damaged by one man's tyranny, they carried forward lessons that reshaped laws, policies, and awareness, leaving a legacy beyond tragedy. The Dawson case did not end with the sentencing of Willard Dawson. Its echoes shaped laws, policies, and public awareness, ensuring no other sons would endure what those mountain boys had suffered. Georgia lawmakers responded quickly. They passed legislation requiring stricter oversight of isolated homesteads, mandating school attendance checks, and empowering deputies to investigate prolonged absences among sons withdrawn from public life by controlling fathers. Hospitals introduced new training for doctors. Physicians were taught to recognize warning signs in boys, malnutrition, genetic abnormalities, psychological delays, that could indicate abuse hidden behind the walls of male-dominated households. Sheriff David Miller spoke publicly, urging vigilance. He admitted regret for not intervening sooner, declaring that silence from neighbors and authorities allowed Willard to build his dynasty unchecked for far too long. Counselor Alan Winters established outreach programs. His mission focused on breaking cycles of indoctrination among isolated boys, teaching them that loyalty did not mean suffering and obedience should never equal submission to abuse. Educational campaigns spread statewide. Posters, lectures, and workshops reminded communities that secrecy could breed corruption. Teachers, coaches, and doctors were urged to report concerns when boys vanished from public spaces without explanation. Reporters chronicled the Dawson saga for years. Their articles ensured the story was not buried. Each headline reminded readers that generations of sons had been trapped until one boy collapsed in town. Academics studied the case. Geneticists published findings documenting the dangers of inbreeding among isolated male lineages. Psychologists examined the effects of generational obedience, noting how silence becomes an inherited prison across multiple sons. Willard Dawson himself remained silent in prison until his death. He never confessed, never apologized. To his final breath, he carried the cold conviction that he had simply preserved tradition. Jacob remained institutionalized. Thomas passed away. Samuel worked in supported carpentry, and the youngest son found modest independence. Their varied fates embodied the spectrum of survival, resilience, and damage left in Willard's wake. The hidden toddler's medical records became case studies. Doctors referenced his life to warn future generations about the compounded risks of secrecy and genetic decline enforced by patriarchs unwilling to break tradition. The 15-year-old survivor grew into a man who dedicated his life to advocacy. Speaking at universities, courts, and community centers, he shared his story, urging vigilance against isolation and silence. His words carried weight. Isolation is not protection, it is prison. Men across the state repeated those lines, acknowledging that strength comes from truth, not from chains of obedience passed down through generations. In Atlanta, a prevention center was named in his honor. It served as a hub where counselors, doctors, and deputies trained to detect patterns of silence among boys living under controlling fathers. National media featured the Dawson saga in documentaries. Viewers across America confronted the truth that even in modern times, isolated patriarchs could twist tradition into tyranny unless communities chose to intervene. Generations later, the Dawson cabin was demolished. The land was reforested, erasing physical reminders. Yet officials insisted the story remain alive, taught in training programs, so no other sons would endure such corruption. The legacy of the Dawson men stands as both tragedy and warning. It reminds us that silence, when passed from father to son, can destroy lives unless broken by courage and truth. Through the collapse of one boy in 1978, an entire dynasty of shadows was exposed. From that moment, Georgia changed, proving that even the darkest secrets among men can be dragged into the light.